So TSX has definitely underperformed the S&P 500. And I think we can sum it up really quickly in two ways. I know there was a BMO economist recently that spoke a bit about this. But what it comes down to, in my opinion, is number one, the makeup of the Toronto Stock Exchange versus the S&P 500 and the two economies, economy in the U.S. versus the economy in Canada. So just discussing the economies very quickly. Economy in the U.S. growing 3-4% GDP right now. Economy in Canada, 1% at best right now. My opinion, I think the U.S. economy being so strong has kept the Canadian economy from falling into what was once predicted a mild recession, because we export and what we pull out of the ground, 70% of that we send to the U.S. If U.S. is doing well, then that helps our economy do better. But even still, we're still not growing at 3-4% as they have been growing down in the U.S. So I think that factors in when you look at the TSX versus the S&P. But probably even more important is what is the makeup of the TSX versus the S&P 500. TSX made up commodities, oil, banking, and by far the number one sector in the U.S. is technology, whether it's communications, whether it's technology, many software, artificial intelligence. I basically put that all together and call that tech. And we know that the S&P 500 is made up of just under 50% technology today, just over 40%. And so technology has been the place to be. We've talked about this on the show many times. So unfortunately for the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is looking for the next, I guess, super cycle with respect to commodities, we saw one a few years back when China was importing everything you can imagine, from copper, all the different base metals. That really helped our economy here in Canada. And in my opinion, it's going to take China to come back strong. We know they're struggling right now, but to come back strong to help us here in Canada and help our markets, because we are a commodity-based market, right? We are also considered a petrocurrency for so long with our exposure, obviously, to the energy sector. So commodities, energy, not doing as well. Technology really knocking the lights out over the past, well, let's call it many years now. First chart I have here shows the equity performance of the different markets, indices. You have the NASDAQ, the one-year number here, 42% growth. You have the Dow Jones, 18%, S&P 500, 29%. A lot of people forget about the Japanese Nikkei, 45% over the last year. Unbelievable. Number one. Not many people know that Japan is doing that well. Compare that to the S&P TSX, you're looking at 6% growth. So obviously a huge underperformance. And in our second chart here, you'll see why. And it all has to do with what the makeup of the S&P 500 and the TSX is. You'll see on the TSX, 58.3% one-year return in technology, which is great. But how much of our market is tech? You know, we have Shopify, we have maybe open text, and then you're pretty much hard pressed to, to find other big tech names that really matter on the index. Whereas you go to technology in the U.S., 59% growth. You look at communication services, 57% growth, and you really see there that it is the tech that is ruling the day. Consumer discretionary, 34%. So you have a lot of different names down in the U.S. on the S&P 500 that are causing the S&P to really outperform the TSX. And unfortunately, I don't envision that changing in the near term. I think that the banking sector will continue to do better, as we showed you with the bank ETF in the previous segment, Nova Scotia Bank stock. But I think the banking sector, which makes up a pretty large component, 25 to 30%-ish of our market here in Toronto Stock Exchange. So I think that will help. But I think if we're looking for help on the oil side or the commodity side, that might take a bit. Whereas if you go down south, there's a lot of tech there. And again, a nice, I guess, reason why individual investors that are in Canada should consider investing abroad, consider investing in the U.S. Their market is larger. And as I've shown you, they seem to be, their markets seem to have the hot areas make up their indices a lot more than we have here on the TSX.